Now to our top story. Canada is hoping to right the wrongs of the past. Well, the government is now pledging $40 billion to address the historic abuse of Indigenous children over many decades. It comes after a year in which multiple grave sites were found across the country, helping expose the rampant mistreatment of those Native kids. RT's Alex Mihailovich has the story for us.
It was a revelation that shocked a nation and the world. This past May, the first in a string of graves was found in Canada. The site in Kamloops, British Columbia, used to be the largest residential school in the country. The remains of 215 Native children were found buried near the institution, some as young as the age of 3. The following month, another 751 unmarked graves were found at a cemetery near a residential school in the province of Saskatchewan. With 130 schools once operating across the nation, the grim discoveries continued.
We don't know a number. We do have some recorded deaths that happened in the school, but there are some other deaths that, like oral history said, that they weren't recorded. The
Canadian government endorsed and funded residential schools. They were operated primarily by the Catholic, Anglican, and Protestant churches from 1831 to 1998. Some believe upwards of 6,000 Indigenous children died at residential schools across the country, most often due to disease, abuse, and neglect. 150,000 First Nations children passed through the system from coast to coast, a system created to assimilate Native children into Canadian society, forcing them to convert to Christianity while not allowing them to speak their native tongues.
I was going to be 4 years old in November when they took me away. I put it away from my mind, a lot of things that happened in the school. This is where they took my culture away. They took my language away from me. They took that love away from my mom. A 2 or 3 year old girl would love to have their mom with them.
In 2015, Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission concluded the country's federal government committed cultural genocide through the system. Amid ongoing negotiations between Canada's federal government and First Nations groups, now Canadian authorities say that approximately 40 billion Canadian dollars, which is about 30 billion US, have been set aside to address the issue. The move was announced in the Canadian government's fall economic update. The money will be used to cover the costs of compensation for Native families harmed by the system and to fund reforms over the next 5 years. A joint statement from Canada's Minister of Indigenous Services, Patty Hajdu, and Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations, Mark Miller, says, "We have been unequivocal throughout these historic negotiations. We will compensate those harmed by the federal government's discriminatory funding practices, and we will lay the foundation for an equitable and better future for First Nations children, their families, and communities." Negotiations are continuing, with First Nations groups saying that there is still much work to be done. Both sides have agreed to a deadline of December the 31st. For News on RT, I'm Alex Mihailovich.
So to discuss the plight of Indigenous people in Canada, we are joined by Jake Spotted Wolf. She's a member of the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara Nation. Thank you so much for joining us, Jake. So let's talk first. $40 billion. Is that enough? What would you rather see besides money?
Actual implementation of change in policy, changing in policing, holding the Catholic Church responsible, the Christian Church responsible. They're never going to do that. You can't pay enough for all the trauma that these families endured. And if you look at the Truth and Reconciliation Act that Canada tried to implement, you'll find that they have done barely anything. It didn't touch the surface of all of the harms. There are still people reeling in mental health issues, alcoholism, addiction, because of the traumas caused to their parents, their grandparents, and to themselves in the residential school systems. So when you research and find that the policies that were put into place before did absolutely nothing, and that the $40 billion is an effort, I'm not sold on the fact that anything is really going to change, and that non-native Canadians will ever reconcile their actual present-day harms. And an example of that looks like some of the race and hate crimes. The Starlight Tours, if you look into that, that's police used to take individuals out into the country about, somewhere between 2 and 5 miles away, underdressed for the weather in frigid temperatures, drop them off, and then bet to see if that individual could make it back to, the town safely. And oftentimes these individuals would die, and they were Indigenous. So that's just one example of how a little bit of awareness, this is a Band-Aid, I think, that funding to really cover up. And there are other really egregious harms. The Mi'kmaq are going through it right now. Indigenous female was hit with a ball hitch a couple of years ago. Her small intestine was ruptured, and she died 5 months later. And somebody threw that at her from the back of a truck.
Wow.
And instead of her, being discussed and all the harms and racism that happens against Natives in that country, they picked her apart for being an alcoholic and for having 7 children. And he was not vilified. He was barely charged, let alone a consequence came to him.
Wow. Now, you have moments even in the United States history where they have just done egregious acts towards Native Americans here. Again, now seeing this with Canada as well. Why is it that you don't think that, or why is it that the media doesn't cover it? You don't see this on the mainstream media. They're not showing these stories of what happens to these people. Why do you think that is?
I have asked myself that a lot the past 7 months that I've been on a frontline camp. I think partially it is that they would have to accept that there was a genocide in this country and in Canada. They would have to accept that white ancestors caused significant harm. They would have to accept that the founding fathers, that the leaders of this country were complicit in not only Black American genocide, but Native American genocide. And that looks like a different reconciliation when it comes to, okay, not only do we have to admit that we caused them harm, but we caused them harm on their land. And that means now we have to give our land back. We have to acknowledge that we have destroyed these people who we came over and just totally blustered in terms of genocide. We didn't have a chance. We fought and fought and fought, and it was never enough. And a great example of the media not picking up these stories, we locked down at the Department of the Interior in October, helicopters swarming above, SWAT teams outside. That was a federal building. And there was one organization that picked that up. Newsweek picked it up. And why did the media, again, I think it's because the media would also have to reconcile and actually dig into their harms. And that is a very uncomfortable place for media to be, because media depends on profit, except for RT. Thanks for telling these stories.
Jake Spotted Wolf, thank you so much for your perspective. We appreciate it. And we're going to keep covering these stories. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.